Welcome to the Golden Crane Award-winning Color Success Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Serena Li is an ad agency professional by day, and by night, she's Duck Duck Books' founder and editor-in-chief. She was born in Guangzhou, raised in Houston, and spent much of her adult life in Seattle. She has long been involved in equity and inclusion efforts in both the public sector and the corporate world. After her little Sophia was born, Serena was struggling with the new world of parenting as a working mom, trying her best to raise a trilingual child. A recent survivor of postpartum depression, Serena bonded with her daughter via books and quality time. But when she had a hard time finding meaningful bilingual books for young children with cross-cultural values that she wanted to pass on, she found her new passion and purpose. Now, she uses Duck Duck Books as a platform to further the causes of diversity, multiculturalism, giving back, and spreading a love of languages. And in her free time, she and Sophia are talking, singing, and of course, reading in Cantonese, Mandarin, and English. Serena, her husband Chris, daughter Sophia, and golden retriever Jojo currently live in Edmonds, Washington. So I wanted to welcome Serena Li to our show. Hi, Serena. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And today we're really going to look at and talk about motherhood and starting your own company and being a mompreneur, all the good stuff. A woman of my heart, because as you know, I have 2 children of my own and running a business and clinician and all that. And so really wanted to open up and talk about the reality of being a working mom and mompreneur. So could you tell me a little bit about your experience having a daughter and also a golden retriever? We have a new puppy. And so, and what your experience was like.
Yeah. Well, 2.5 years ago, actually, wow, I can't believe really time flies. Thinking back, I had a really relatively smooth pregnancy. I remember being very happy, energetic, and hungry. My craving was steak. I would eat so much that even my husband was surprised. Yeah, like while I was pregnant, I really missed that time. It was such a wonderful period of my life. I traveled for work, for fun. I was just very determined that, being pregnant is not going to slow me down for anything.
Absolutely.
So even at 6 months pregnant, I was still traveling for work. I remember it was the summer and I was attending the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad completion ceremony with my client in Utah. That was an event commemorating the contribution of Chinese immigrants, which I hold dear to my heart. And that day I walked several miles in the mountain, just enjoying the event and the sight, and I barely felt tired. And then coming back home, like the last trimester, I was suffering from this awful rash that was on my hand and my legs.
Wow.
It was so itchy that I could not sleep. But I was still thriving. I got a new job. I still hung out with my friends. I'm just this one happy pregnant lady, and no obstacle is gonna slow me down for anything. And then my daughter came. So she came 2 weeks early, not premature by medical standard, but it was 2 weeks before we were ready. My husband and I were so unprepared. We didn't even have the car seat installed. So he's out there in a driveway trying to install the car seat at 1 a.m. in the morning. And we also didn't read any baby books. I just thought I had more time. And then it kind of just all went downhill from there because it wasn't as planned, right? Yeah, so then we have my beautiful little daughter. But the hardest thing really was breastfeeding. I like to joke that I honestly can push out a baby like 10 times more. But I really I just could not grasp breastfeeding from the beginning. It's really the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. Partly it's due to the lack of experience and just unaware of resources available. You thought this is something that should have been natural.
That it would just
Um,
happen automatically. And there's all these like techniques and things.
yeah, that I would not have known otherwise. So I suffer from low supply, which then led to mastitis, and it took legit 1 month of around the clock feeding, pumping to get the supply up. It's like the triple feeding that they
Yeah.
call it. And then
And
on top
drinking
of,
tons of water. And I don't know if you tried that
yeah,
nasty tea, but
I did. I
oh,
did. Yeah, I tried everything. Like, because I was so determined to get this done. So I was willing to just push myself to the hardest. Um, I thought that I'm basically like a non-organic cow that just gets attached to these
oh
machines
yeah,
and
that it
sit there all
definitely feels
day.
like you have udders and you're just that's
Yeah.
what your milk supply.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, and on top of that, my daughter had a tongue tie.
Mm.
Which is really a detriment to breastfeeding, until it's revised. Uh, but the around the clock rehab exercise and then hearing her scream in the middle of the night because it's not a comfortable thing, just kind of added to that difficult postpartum experience.
I really want to touch upon this because I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of perceived expectation and societal expectation that women produce milk, they breastfeed, it's the best way to go, and it's not for everybody, and it is hard and challenging to produce that much milk for your baby.
Yeah, no, absolutely. um and come to think of it, right, hindsight is I could have probably gotten a lot more rest, which would have been really helpful in postpartum um time period than just sitting there at 2 a.m. in the morning because it's the best time to pump and
Yeah.
it's needed. But yeah, there's a first time for everything really. And I think that expectation of being what society want us to be, just hindsight, it's like, is it really worth it? I'm grateful to
Yeah.
have that experience, but you know,
Well, I don't
second time
know,
around.
you're sweet in saying you're grateful, but one thing that was really hard during, I sound like an old geezer, during my time was there were no pods to pump, right? It was
Yeah.
like for me anyways, I took my licensing exam and there was supposed to be, they said would be accommodation to pump milk. And the people were like, huh? No, you can pump in our break room. So I literally like paused the test, went to pump in their break room and went back to it. And it's like the expectation or the things that you have to, quote unquote. I mean, at that point, it would have been painful if I didn't do it, but um, those things are difficult, and there's not necessarily accommodations for doing these things.
Yeah. Wow. It's so nice, mother to mother, sometimes to talk about these things. Like just to know that
Absolutely.
I'm not alone and that you have to make that sacrifice and sit in a break room that's probably a closet at that point you know, to do what you have to do. And then at the same time, you still have to do this test.
Well, it's so funny because it's like once you are out there and you pump all this milk and you have like your boobs out, TMI, but it's like I don't care if you walk in on me. Like I gotta do what I gotta do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, my baby gotta eat.
Exactly. So one of the things that you mentioned to me before we started the interview was just that postpartum depression or sadness, and I'm wondering if you could touch upon that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So, before I realized I had postpartum, really, it was around 8 months um, after I have my baby. I had prolapse, even though it wasn't severe, but my body was, I used to be so into health and just maintaining my body, but then now it's no longer perfect, and I honestly don't know even who to blame for this, right? And and it was really hard on me, and basically was probably the point where it kind of just like went downhill from there. I asked my physical therapist, will it ever get better? Is it, is my prolapse going to be just forever with me? And of course, being a medical professional, they don't want to get my hopes up. So they said, well, you got to start rehab, and it's going to be an ongoing process, and we cannot guarantee that it will ever get back to normal, but at least you can try.
Can you explain what
And
prolapse is for those that
yeah,
don't know?
yeah, basically it's how it felt is you have this ball in your vagina. It's basically when the wall of your bladder kind of collapse, and it's like, it's this it could lead to incontinence, which a lot of women thought it was just natural after baby, but it really isn't.
Yeah.
Now pelvic health is really important. So how you breathe and how you go to the bathroom, all of that have an impact to it. And I honestly really encourage all women to take care of themselves and to talk to their doctor, because it deserves to have a good quality of life without need to worry about that you're leaking in your
Mm-hmm.
pants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one thing that I found out, it's a lot of women after they have baby actually have some sort of prolapse, but because of the lack of knowledge around it, people didn't seek help, and it's kind of just, like it will not get better unless if you start doing rehab exercise and take care of yourself.
Yeah, and I think this I love how this episode is going because we're getting, super graphic, and I'm sorry to my
Oh yeah.
editor and husband for listening to this, but I and they should, because we do amazing things as women and mothers that they will never have to do just biologically speaking. And women think that leakage is natural, which it is to some extent, but then it's like no cause for concern, right?
Yeah.
In their mind. So, I mean, how was the process of rehab, and did it help?
It absolutely had help for my prolapse. I would say, to this day, I'm back to 100%, if not actually have a stronger pelvic floor than I did pre-baby. Now, of course, it did take 2.5 years of daily rehab and just making sure that I'm very conscious in how I, you know, um, do my day-to-day things, how I lift heavy things, how I, push during, number two. It's funny that it's really getting into all the details.
I mean, that's the
Um,
reality of it.
no, but there is hope. But it takes a lot of diligence, definitely. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I think women need to, be more in tune with their body and really seek help. And sometimes your doctor, especially American doctor, they don't even they are not trained in this area, and they really don't even know better to tell you. So you really have to go to a physical therapist to get this done. In France, actually, all the postpartum women have a required session with a physical therapist to check pelvic floor. But in America, there isn't. And so I remember, I was feeling uncomfortable down there, and I talked to um, my my doctor, and all she said was, "Well, welcome to motherhood." I would not accept that as an answer,
Mhm.
because in my opinion, being a mother and kind of getting to this milestone should not have anything that would interfere with my life. Like, I can still be the career driven woman that I am. I can still be a great friend and a wonderful wife. But now I have this using motherhood as an excuse really for things that happened to my body. And it was just, that was devastating to
Yeah.
me,
And
right?
you
I
kind
did not
of
sign up
beat
for
yourself
this.
up. You beat yourself up about
I
it,
really
right?
did.
Yeah.
I really did. Yeah. And so yeah, so and so kind of going back to like postpartum depression, kind of knowing that something is no longer perfect in my body, but at the same time, I have all this pressure, right, that I put on myself of breastfeeding, of pumping at work, and still had to do a great job at work after returning to work post maternity. It just hindsight, I was putting all these on myself. Um, you know, that mental health just became the last thing that I think about. So then fast forward 8 month postpartum, that was around COVID lockdown. Um, Probably it was the postpartum hormone combined with stress from work, and then with just the environmental stress from COVID really have made a perfect cocktail for depression, right? In hindsight, I mean, there are warning signs. Just like how I discovered my prolapse, there were warning signs. But I just didn't know that they were signs. They were red flags. I just, you know, in my family, nobody talked about mental health, and it
Yes.
actually for a lot of Asian families, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they like to just brush that off the rug. And so I remember taking my daughter to pediatric checkup, and you know how they give you a piece of paper with the questionnaire and
Mm-hmm.
to see if I have depression. The Asian genes in me would always be like, no, I'm just normal. I'm great. Like I would never grade myself lower um, than a
Isn't
normal.
that funny? Like even on a self symptom inventory, self-reported inventory, we're like, we have to be
We
getting
have
an
to
A
be A
plus.
plus. Yeah, no, exactly. So the doctor really didn't know, right? And in these type of high functioning depression, on the outside, I'm probably the happiest person that you will ever meet. I'm probably the friendliest person that you would ever meet. So how would you know that this person who have everything going for her would have depression, really?
Well, I think
Um,
there's a
mhm.
piece in yourself too that there's a denial, right? Of like, no, everything's fine. I can juggle all these balls at once, but I mean, it'll eventually crash because it's in you're human. We're all human, and so putting those pressures on yourself is very stressful.
Yeah. Um, yeah. And really thinking back, postpartum depression was a really dark place for me. I think it's not talked about enough. So that's why I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it in your show. Um, and yeah, I'll probably go into some pretty graphic details here. Um, so I remember I had these scary thoughts and plan out scenarios in my head, right, that I just could not get out of. Um, you know how they say self-care, take a long bath, relax. Well, I wanted to take a long bath, but I was scared of the thought that I would drown my baby, or
Mhm.
drown with my baby. And then I would go in a spiral and get into kind of just thinking, okay, well, if I drown and if I die, will anyone care? I Because of COVID, we built out a home gym and a garage, and I am just so traumatized at the thought of hanging from the power rack that I could not even go into the home gym for a while. And then one night I had these plan out scenario in my head of how I could kill myself without leaving a mess or a hassle for others. Um, I was scared by my own thought and imagination and the details that gone into it. My husband was sleeping and my daughter was sleeping, but there I was wide awake, right?
Mhm.
Shaken, feeling devastated. And then there was one thought that came to my mind. Um, and it was the only thought that have saved me. I thought, if I die, how would I know what my daughter would look like when she turns 18? Will she look more like me or my husband? It's this curiosity that really just kept me in that moment of not acting out what I have all planned out.
Mhm.
And then I did something that I would not never do normally. I woke my husband up. And I told him, I said, I'm really sorry. I had these thoughts. I don't know what to do. Surprisingly, my husband did not get angry at me waking him up. Like, he just calmly said, you need help. Go to bed, talk to your doctor tomorrow. And then tomorrow came. I never call my doctor because when you're depressed, like even a small task like brushing your teeth could seem pretty daunting.
Yeah.
But thankfully, my husband actually reached out to my doctor and scheduled an appointment for me. And that's when I was diagnosed with severe postpartum depression. I got on medication and I started therapy. It took 4 months of weekly therapy and close to a year of medication for me to get out of the hell. It took longer for medication because I was breastfeeding at the time.
Hmm.
And so they, you know, it's just not a good combination to be quitting breastfeeding and try to quit medication at the same time. So so the therapist and the doctor helped me work out a plan that will work well for me while I can still achieve my goal of breastfeeding for more than a year.
Thank you so
Um,
much for sharing that. I know you'll expand on it, but that is so brave to say because I think a lot of people also say, well, I can't be on any medication. And, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a psychologist, but I will say to balance out those pros and cons of it, because if you cannot literally get out of bed or make a phone call, how are you going to breastfeed your child? And so that there is that aspect of the need for behavioral activation in that sense, and to know that one, what was really brave about what you said was you asked for help, you told
mhm.
somebody. That's the big thing, right? Is a lot of people internalize it and then it just bubbles up. I mean, and the thoughts accumulate, which may lead to actual impulse or action. You asked at a very crucial time too, because what we know about suicide is if you can just create a buffer where the emotion isn't overtaking rationality, then you can get the help that you need.
Yep.
You also advocated for, or your husband initiated, but you advocated for yourself and to let other women and people know that it is a process. There, just because you take medication doesn't mean boom, I'm
It
not
doesn't get
depressed anymore.
exactly. Yeah, no, yeah. And even now that I am no longer on medication, that I no longer needed therapy, it doesn't just mean that depression just goes away. It still sometimes comes back, just like the clouds, like it could still come back and there are still thoughts. But now that I know when the thoughts are coming into my head, I can identify it and I don't let myself entertain it any further, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's really what therapy does, is to help you with the tools that you would need so that you know what to do when they come back again.
Absolutely. And to know that everyone can go through that sadness and it's not just moms or um, people with clinical depression, right? It's like there's good days, bad days, and everything in between. And COVID has brought an extra level of stress for everybody. And
Yeah.
so it's a difficult time. And, I'm so proud of you for raising a baby during this time and now a toddler because it's different and there's a different barriers and challenges to face for our children at very young ages.
Yeah, yeah, completely. And I do feel very grateful that I have the opportunity to seek therapy. While there are a lot of people out there that perhaps didn't have the resources available,
Yes.
right? But for those that are able to seek therapy, I definitely strongly uh, encourage that because it's not just doing it for yourself, it's doing it for your family, for people that you care about. And then some of the benefits that came out of therapy, it's not just healing my own depression at the moment, but also uncovering some of the root cause of
Hmm.
these baggage that I've had growing up, and ultimately led me to approach those things a little bit differently, to know how to let go of those baggages too.
Absolutely. And I think that's the really important part is examining some past or past risk factors or things, even genetics, right? Like
Yeah.
I know that in a lot of Asian American families, they're not really talking about it, but there's intergenerational trauma,
Yep.
especially those that
Mm-hmm.
have immigrated here. And
Mm-hmm.
again, keep your head down and don't make waves. And
Yep.
as Asian
Conform.
females, yes,
Yeah.
not speak up, not tell anybody about anything.
Yep.
So it
Yeah.
definitely is a good thing to address as well during your process.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most memorable conversations that I've had with my therapist pretty early on is when she told me that actually most of her clients were women that are very driven. And that was eye-opening to me because, growing up, you would think that people who are depressed usually didn't have things going for them and it didn't go
Right,
the way that they wanted. But it was actually opposite. It's because driven women have put so much pressure on themselves to achieve that they are perhaps the one that would fall the hardest.
right. The high
Um,
expectations of self and others.
yeah, absolutely. And like you said, as Asian women, we learn to do things, just get it done
Mhm.
ourselves and not seek help because at the same time we're trying to not be perceived as weak or failing, right? But then now I realize, kind of going through that whole experience, that the ability to acknowledge my own thought and the ability to come up with the courage to seek help and to recognize my own need and putting myself first, it's actually a form of growth and strength.
Mhm.
And it's really nothing to be ashamed of. And I'm really proud of myself that I have overcame. And I am hoping that by speaking of these experiences that I can help somebody out there who might feel that they are alone in it and feeling the inadequateness and just the lack of control in their life, and just know that they are all very valid, that I felt exactly the same, and it's like we can overcome it
And there's
just like
help
all the
out
other
there.
women that did out there. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's such a range. It's a great point because it there's a lot of factors or risk factors for folks without resources and basic needs not being met. And there's also the spectrum of those that are really driven and maybe have higher incomes, but just also don't seek help because of the shame, the embarrassment.
Yeah.
And I think it's just really important that if you feel something is off, to really see what kinds of resources are out there. And I try to post as many resources as I can on, Color Success Instagram, because domestic violence is, rampant, especially
Yeah.
with couples being, in lockdown together. And what I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed is people are really either happy with their choices of partner or it's just a nightmare, right? And so of course there's everything in between, but it definitely tests a relationship and a family when everyone is together 24/7. So let's move to how did Duck Duck Books come about? Because this seems like something that was inspired by a really difficult time and
Yeah.
also just something you wanted to, give back to your daughter.
Yeah. Yes. As I was going through the therapy sessions, and it really became clear that I need to identify my passion, and channel this energy, this to build something, um, that would help me get through the mundane day to day. I'm a Gemini. I do not do well with boredom. So I needed something exciting and challenging, really. So in those sleepless nights, and as you know, a depressed person, very having a hard time falling asleep sometimes. I Instead of letting my mind kind of just go into the dark places, I started channeling all that inspiration toward building something for my daughter and hoping for the generation, of her age and for the world. And that's how Duck Duck Books was born. I secured my business license when my daughter turned 1. just to keep myself accountable that
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna happen, um, and that I need to see this to the end, and then the business launch a year after, so launch in August of 2021.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How did books really help you bond with little Sophia?
Yeah, so Dr. Books is a publisher of multilingual and multicultural board books for children, and it have a focus on social emotional early learning. So all of these, I would take this sentence apart in a bit because each of them have personal connections to me. So why books? Why do I want to make books? Um, Thinking back, one of the ways that really helped me get through depression, other than therapy and medication, was quality time with my daughter. She really loves reading, and she would want me to read books over and over and over again, to a point that I can like lay in her bed, close my eyes, and like cite the book
You're
from
so
cover
funny.
to cover.
It drives me crazy. I'm just like, no, I'm not reading this again.
Yeah, sometimes I'll be like, do you want a different book? Just to give it some variety. And then eventually when she started talking and babbling, she would blurb out phrases from these books. And that's what really got me thinking of, wow, these books have a great impact in a child's development and their life. So that got me thinking of making meaningful books for our children where they can take the phrases and blab it out later in life and would help them. And that's why I wanted to make books, really. Now, of course, there are a lot of different books. I could have made any book, but I wanted to make multilingual books because I am a 1.5 generation Chinese American, and I speak fluent Cantonese and Mandarin. I really see firsthand really how my multilingual skills can help me build relationship with others, and
Mhm.
just what a great skill to have, right? So I wanted to instill that to my daughter as well, to keep that language and culture alive. My day job is in an ad agency, and we would use a process called transcreation, which is, instead of direct translation of taking the word, you know, as is to write a story from ground up, so that the story and the imagery and the copy is staying true to the intent and the culture of the target language. So in other words, all of my books, if you compare them side by side, there's a little bit of differences and nuances to them. And that process generally was used in marketing, but I am leveraging that knowledge to run DuckDuck Books as well.
Well, maybe you can become an agent, because I was just like, sign me up, Serena. Like, manage my life for me. Although you don't need to do that, but you don't need another thing on your plate. But I was like, oh my God, take my brand to the next level. That's like, your pitch is so great. But in all seriousness, I think the books are just so meaningful. And the fact that you're making them, you make the decisions, there's a sense of agency involved in that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, and then another aspect, other than just the language, is the multicultural aspect of it. So racial equity and social justice is a topic that I care deeply about, and I have been long involved in in these effort, both in the public sector as well as in the corporate world. Um, you might have noticed that with recent events, from Black Lives Matter to, anti Asian hate.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of companies and organizations now offer race and culture workshops for employees.
Mhm.
Um, Many people just think that DEI is something that only adults would understand, but it's really not true. In fact, the later on you are um, introducing these topics, it's harder for people to
Mhm.
grasp and to understand, because it is harder to unlearn something, right? So I really wanted to start this concept young for our children, to help them acknowledge and appreciate diversity. Uh, you know, it's the only way, in my opinion, that would help make sure our future generation is living in a more just and equitable world.
Mhm.
Um, and if it wasn't because of COVID, I would have taken my daughter to live in different countries and to experience different culture and learn different languages. But because of COVID, it's really difficult to do that. And so the next best thing is really to feature multiculturalism in my books, using kids from different backgrounds of all abilities, and really carry that messages that are deeply rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and use that as early learning tools for children just like my daughter.
I love that. Yeah. And, it's so important. And just, my youngest, who's older than yours, but explaining nuances of culture or racial differences,
Yeah.
because she's like, oh, is so and so from Harry Potter Asian? I'm like, no, what are you talking about? They're white. And then she was like, we're like people. She's like, how do you know, right? And this is not a blanket statement, but people that look like us. And then you're like, but there's a small amount of people that look like us on TV. So it's
Yeah.
very difficult to explain those slight nuances because my husband, he's funny. He's just, very blunt. He's like, they don't, they have white skin. And then, but then she rationalizes, well, mommy is light skinned. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is like such a complicated topic to
Yeah.
deconstruct for children and adults,
And you will
So,
feel as adults that it's hard to find the words.
yeah,
And sometimes it's almost
could be
harder for us to
offensive.
explain it. Yeah,
Yeah.
than children who really just wanted to know.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Which is
thank you
great.
for that
We have,
story.
yeah, we have conversations all the time because obviously, I'm very social justice oriented. And I
Yes.
think because they're at a level where we can have these conversations, when, putting up pictures in our window and, there's a gorgeous artist painting or print that I put up in the windows, the Stop AAPI Hate and just gorgeous, right? And but the idea is there is a social justice message there, and
Yeah.
also there's a risk because my father-in-law was like, take down the Black Lives Matter pictures because he was just so worried as an Asian male immigrant in his 70s that people would start targeting our house. And that's definitely the parallel, right, between maybe the younger generation and the older, which is like, again, don't speak out against these injustices. We've dealt with them all our lives, but
Yeah.
at some point, you have to take a stand however you can.
Yeah, really. Um, I completely relate to how your father feel. It's something that my parents also feel the same as well.
Mhm.
But sometimes that fear, if we live in that fear and not do anything about it, then others who didn't have the opportunity to stand up for themselves really have no one to advocate for them. So that's why, to acknowledge and internalize that there is that risk and there's that fear, but to still be out there, like you putting up, you know, um, the pictures and supporting and showing your support, is so important,
Well,
right?
if
So,
you remain silent too, it also breeds at times compliance and, you know, almost like this silent agreement as to this is how things are. And through that, things don't change. And I know
mhm,
obviously there's so much fear in our communities because of what's been happening. But,
yeah,
at the same time, it's like we have to really try to understand each other and where we're coming from versus this person is bad because they're part of this ethnicity, this ethnic group, etc.
yeah, absolutely. You touch on a really good point of empathy, um, which it's part of social emotional skill set. Emotional intelligence is a huge part of that. So when I was, making books for Duck Duck Books, I thought about, well, what topics would I make them in? Um, And something that stood out to me are social emotional skills
Mm-hmm.
and EQ,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of great books out there that teaches vocabulary, teaches the ABCs, the one, two, threes. And I think they are wonderful resources that I really can't make them any better. However, there is a lack of children's books really that touch on this aspect of emotional intelligence. Growing up as Asian American, right? Like we probably never really talk about empathy too much.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a word that is difficult to grasp because it's not a physical thing. And and oftentimes our Asian parents are, trying to get us to score the test higher, like evaluate our IQ, and like they focus so much on the IQ that they really forgot how important EQ is to make sure the child will grow up with the skills that they need to succeed
Mm-hmm.
in life, right? So my dad is a huge advocate of empathy, and like he's the one that would take me around the country while we were growing up in China, to visit different parts of the country, and telling me stories of their people, which had a huge impact in my life in you know being able to relate to a person and what they are going through without necessarily myself going through that exact same thing. My mom, however, is your standard tiger mom that's just like, why are you doing all these traveling? Like she have a test coming up. She need to score an A plus on it, right? And later on, I found out through my therapy actually that she also suffered from mental illness, but because she
Mm-hmm.
refused to seek treatment, it kind of just became her personality, became who she is. And ultimately, all those had affected my quality of life and led to my depression. So, so yeah, I really wanted to make books that touches on all of these aspects of building your self-esteem, your confidence, and being able to learn to accept and love others even though they are different from you, and really touch on these social emotional skill set, because I know once my child you know gets into school, she's going to learn her ABCs and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So you know I just want to focus at 0 to 5 years old, while they're growing their brains, to 80% by year of 3, that the first messages that they received, it's around these EQ skills.
Absolutely. And like you mentioned, there's a lack of it. Fortunately, in my daughter's schools, they really emphasize that as well, along with the academics. They have meditation time and stuff like that, and it's public.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
really it's blown me away. But I think that is a huge gap. And there's a nuance between sympathy and empathy, which is
Hmm.
sympathy is feeling sorry for somebody or pitying them, whereas empathy is understanding perhaps what the other person is going through, being in their shoes.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And I'm so glad you're doing this because it's so needed, especially in Asian American communities, because one could argue that higher EQ will make you more successful than getting straight A's, just because in this day
Absolutely.
and age, you have to learn systems and building relationships. And just because you have the best GPA doesn't mean that you're going to be successful or be at the highest level, because if you can't talk to anybody or relate, then that's going to be really difficult on your life.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
So, I've been asking a lot of guests this question. What is one question that you wish someone would ask you, and what would your response be?
I guess, perhaps the question would be around, how do you do it all? Working a full-time job, being a mom, being a wife, being friends to others, and being an entrepreneur. Um, And just like, how do you find time to self-care?
How do you? I'd love to know.
I think something that I'm learning through the last couple of years, um, of doing all these things that are quite stressful and demanding at times. And sometimes I do feel the guilt of, these are hours that I could have spent on my daughter, but I'm working instead and, doing other things instead. I think one of the lessons that I would give to a younger me would be that it's okay to not be 100% all the time, that it's okay to take it one step at a time, even if it's just a tiny step, you know. Because I do think that sometimes this pressure and stress is self-inflicted.
Yeah.
And so if we let that expectation go and just take it one step at a time, progress will be made. Otherwise, we're just feeling so daunting from this big thing that we're trying to achieve. But
Absolutely.
in the end, nobody around me is really pushing for me to achieve it. I wanted to achieve it myself. So just acknowledging where that stress is coming from, and let it be okay to be not 100%. I think it's probably something that I would tell my younger me, and that I would take with me for years to come.
Yeah, it's funny because my goal this year is to not have as many goals, which is it's funny, but um, it's true in that yesterday, after all this time working 7 days a week, I finally took a mental health day, and it was fabulous. I told my husband, please don't bring the kids home early. I went shopping. I just sat on a bench at the mall, and like just that silence and that peace for myself was just so refreshing. And actually wearing clothes and not like sweatpants all day was fantastic. So I totally agree. You don't have to be perfect in everything, because just imagine if you're sending your kids that message. It's a lot of pressure to put on them, and it's not going to
Yeah.
make them happy, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And also another thing that's great, to manage stress is exercise. I know this sounds so cliche, but it's actually so true. So this year I actually are, you know, carving time out of the day to make sure I have 30 minutes just for myself to do nothing but to
Mhm.
move my body.
Yeah, that's great.
Um, and yeah, back then I would just be like, oh, I don't have enough time for it. But then I realized, if it matters to you, you'll find time.
Mhm.
So just all about reprioritizing what's important for
Absolutely.
myself. Yeah.
Well, where can folks learn more about Duck Duck Books and buy the books and follow your journey?
Yes. So check out our website, duckduckbooks.com. And my books are also available on Amazon. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So really appreciate everyone supporting us in our journey. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Serena. I am so happy that you shared your story, and I will be continuing to support Duck Duck Books and you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.